Wow, those songs preached. Sometimes, sometimes I think you should just go home after the songs, but that's not what Pastor Rob told me to do. So I'll stay here. We're going to be in 1 Samuel today. If you guys want to get a head start, jump over there. My name's Amie Regester. I saw some new faces today. Some visitors, this is their first stop in the U.S., so welcome, whether you're down the street or came from across the world today. So glad to join with you in worship and just ask your prayers this morning. I'm a new mom. This is my first time trying to, yes, yeah, not for me, but for the doctor who gave me the epidural. Trying to do a sermon as a new mom was a different challenge. So that for my husband also. Yes, he held that baby. Oh, man, let's have a word of prayer this morning to ask God to make up for what I lack. God, thank you so much for my friends, new and old, here today. We are the church. We're not in church. We are the church. And God, we ask that you would give us a nugget, a snack today, a spiritual sustenance, something for us and something to share with others. And we're grateful that you're meeting us here today, that you're lending us your ear. And we want to give you worship and glory, for your character is above anything that we have understood. And we know you are good, and we revel in that today. Amen. I have this clicker. Let's see if I know how to work it. Yes, that's me. That's my email address, and I would love to chat with you, do a Bible study with you. I'm a digital evangelist here at Sunnyvale, so if there's any way I can serve you digitally, please let me know. Our title for today is called Fool Around and Find Out. My husband taught me this acronym. Maybe you've heard it a little bit differently, but we're going to call it Fool Around and Find Out, FAFO. And as you can see by this graph, the more you decide to fool around, the more you what? The more you find out. Fool around a little, find out a little. Fool around a lot, you're going to find out a lot. And the way the kids these days use this phrase is that you say it as a threat delivered to somebody who's doing something that you think they shouldn't be doing. They're in some kind of business that you know that they don't belong being in. And it's not necessarily immediate, but you say this when people are going to eventually meet up with a demise. So now you know you can sound hip and cool by saying fool around and find out. All right, there you go. So today I'm going to introduce you to a couple of brothers who indeed spent a good deal of their life fooling around, and they're about to what? That's right. They're about to find out. What are they going to find out? That's what you are going to find out. So hang out with me today in 1 Samuel. And to understand why the story about these two brothers with weird names, Hophni and Phinehas, to know why this story is important, you have to kind of pair it with what Pastor Rob's been talking about, the rise of Samuel and why Israel needs Samuel so desperately. Well, it's because of guys like these two brothers. They are wicked guys. In fact, as we'll get into here in the text, the Bible calls them sons of Belial or Belial. I'm not sure how to say it, but the Bible's going to give us 3 snapshots of what these brothers were doing that was so wicked and why God had to step in and intervene and do something for Israel. So you ready to go? Let's get into the text. Okay, so if you want to turn on your Bibles or open your Bibles, whatever it is that you do with your Bibles, we're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse 12. We're not going to read all of chapters 2 and 4, but we're going to be hanging out in chapters 2 and 4. Okay, so Chapter 2, verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. Some versions say scoundrels, some say sons of Belial, but it's explained right after. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was a practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged flesh hook, or you could imagine a big fork, in his hand while the meat was boiling. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come up and say to the man who sacrificed, "Give meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." And if the man said to him, "They should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart desires," he would answer him, "No, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. Before I go into the serious stuff, I do want to note that these men were called young men, and as their dad was in his 90s, I wonder how young they were, or if this was more they were acting like young fools. Just curious. So let's talk about this passage before we go on to some of the other ones. This is snapshot number 1. Snapshot number 1, the Bible makes a big deal out of these guys ruining the offering of the Lord. They are scoundrels, they're sons of Belial, because they are taking for granted one of the most beautiful offerings in the Bible. It's called the peace offering. Now, I don't know if you've studied this, but there are 5 different kinds of offerings that would happen in the temple. And we're all familiar with one of the ones that we're most familiar with, the sin offering, which is where the animal would be burnt as an offering to take the place of the person who sinned, right? That's the one that we all kind of know about. But the peace offering was so cool. It came after those sins were atoned for, after those sins had been accounted for. The peace offering, the person would do voluntarily, and they would bring the animal in. Of course, they would take its life, and there were 3 parts. It was divided into 3 sections, okay? There was one section for God, and God, being the great guy that he is, only asked for the fat and the kidneys. That was God's portion of this offering. And then the priest, because he was a servant of God working for the Lord and he didn't get paid, he got a chunk of the meat to feed his household. And he would get the right shoulder, right thigh, and that would go to feed his family. And then the great majority of the meat would go back to the person who brought the animal. So you're basically bringing an animal and then getting to take it home and feast or feed with your friends and family. And this was supposed to be a beautiful picture. How can the death of an animal be a beautiful picture? Well, in this case, because it was voluntary and because it involved all parts, it was supposed to represent what life is like when we are at peace with God and man. That's what the peace offering was supposed to be. And it looked like a feast. So say you bring the lamb and you get most of the meat back. Well, you would go into this little side room or this little dwelling place, and you would have your friends and your family there. And oftentimes, as it is today, you invite the pastor to lunch. So even though the priest got their right side of the animal, sometimes they would also say, "Hey, priest, why don't you come enjoy this feast with us?" So it was like everybody with their mad Thanksgiving feast. And this was a regular part of Hebrew culture, and everybody knew how beautiful it was. This was like the best offering. Now, what are these 2 brothers doing with this offering? Well, sometimes they're coming up with the big flesh hook and they're grabbing into the pot of the portion that was supposed to go back to you. They don't just want the right side. They're hungry. They want the left side too. They're taking, the bigger the fork, they're going in and they're grabbing it. So that's supposed to be off limits for them, first of all. But second of all, did you notice that the text says that even before God gets his portion of the fat, they're saying, give it to us now. We don't want your nasty boiled meat. We're into barbecue, so we want it now. And then if the offerer would protest because they know that fat is supposed to go to the Lord, they'd say, no, just, hey, man, take it easy. We're going to do this by the book. We're going to make sure God gets his portion. Then the servant of the priest were instructed to take it by force. Can you imagine going to offer your offering knowing that it was supposed to go to God and somebody right in front of you is robbing you and robbing God? And this way, they were making a mockery of God and a mockery of church. They were those hypocrites that we all talk about. And little by little, Israel's faith in the promises and the workings of God and their trust, of course, in the clergy and in the church was greatly diminished. They were making a laughingstock. By taking this offering, they were saying, we don't, not only do we not care about God, but we don't even care about you. And so that's why God was so offended by them ruining this offering. So this shows that they had no regard for God at all. Let's look at this snapshot. Here's a quote from, I believe, Matthew Henry's commentary. In the peace offering, all parties, God, priest, and man, share in the same meal and satisfaction. It shows all in peaceful communion or peaceful fellowship. It's basically the communion service before the communion service. It was all about everyone taking and making right with their family and with God. Because it was placed in sequence on top of the other two offerings, the peace offering is directly connected to them, depicting the effect of perfect devotion to God and man, peaceful satisfaction and fellowship, keeping the two great commandments of the law, love God and love your neighbor. Well, my friends, it doesn't get better, it gets worse. The second snapshot of these guys and how bad they were and how they were destroying Israel's faith was that they were actually sleeping with the women who served at the gate of the tent of meeting, the Bible says. Let's take a quick look there. Look at verse 22. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from the people about all these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among God's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them? His sons, however, did they listen to their father? Nope. It says they did not listen to their father's rebuke. And then there's a little sentence there that is very troubling. It says, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. We'll talk about that in a second. But who were these women? They could have been Levites. They could have been related to the priests who were serving. They could have been like Samuel, dedicated to the Lord, because not only Levites worked in the sanctuary. You could pledge a certain amount of time. You could go as a volunteer. So we don't know exactly who these women were, but they were ministers of the day, and they were working hard on the Lord's behalf, which makes it incredibly disgusting that these men would take advantage of the women who were serving. And, we can't put all the blame on them. Maybe they were charming. Maybe they were like, hey, my daddy's the high priest. I can show you a little peek behind the curtain. I don't know what their game was and if it was friendly, but it seems like they were down to coerce from the first part. And so maybe this is me reading in, but I'm guessing there was at least part of their station as priests that was intimidating to these women, and that they used that to their advantage. It's something that, unfortunately, anytime you have a place of power, whether it's in church or in business or whatever, people take advantage of it. And we see that from the earliest times of the church. There's never been a time of perfection, and that's why we need Jesus. So they were taking advantage of these women serving, and this was enough that their father Eli called them out about it. We don't know how many times, but he talked to them about it. He said, hey, the reports are bad, change your ways. And did they do it? They did not. Ellen White has, author and writer Ellen White, has a quote that I wanted to read regarding what was going on at this time. It says, these unfaithful priests also transgressed God's law, dishonoring their sacred office by their vile and degrading practices, yet they continued to pollute by their presence in the tabernacle of God. Many of the people, filled with indignation at the corrupt course of Hophni and Phinehas, ceased to come to the appointed place of worship. Have you ever stopped coming to church because you just can't stand how corrupt the people are? I can ask that because you're here now, and so I know you're not there yet here at Sunnyvale, but that's serious PR problems, which again have existed for God's church since the beginning. What we do matters. How we conduct ourselves matter. People will come to church or not come to church, come to fellowship or be turned off by fellowship by the way that we conduct our business. And these guys were the worst of the worst. She continues, the service which God had ordained was despised and neglected because associated with the sins of wicked men, while those whose hearts were inclined to evil were emboldened in sin. So this stuff was prevailing. Now, I'm going to skip over some of this text, and I'm just going to tell you what happens during this time. Because Hophni and Phinehas just continued in their evil, didn't care what people thought, didn't care about the rebuke of their father, the high priest, because they just kept going, God sent a man of God. The Bible doesn't name who it was. We don't know which prophet it was. But he sends somebody, and there is a prophecy given that says, because of all this witness, I'm going to have to step in. And let it be a sign to you that this reign of your household, Eli, this passing down of the high priesthood, no more. It's not going to belong to you. I'm taking it away. I promise that you and your sons, all the way from Aaron's lineage, we're going to continue on. But I'm taking it away and I'm giving it to a worthy prophet. And this is what Rob has been preaching on, the rise of Samuel to take this place. This is directly related to how terrible it was in Israel. And so we see that the promise of Samuel's coming and Hannah's faith in giving her son to worship and work at the temple, all of that was ordained by God. And that's super cool. But so the prophecy said that leading in worship will go away from Eli's household. He's going to give it to a worthier priest. And the sign for this is going to be that those two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they will die on the same day. Sounds like a Netflix special or something. Like, tune in to see what's going to happen. There's one verse I wanted to look at. I think it's the end of 29. This man of God calls Eli out. He says, "Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people?" Um, the reason I bring this is because at the end of the story, we find out that Eli was a hefty man. And so, like, this is such a slap in the face. Like, you have literally been taking the food and you're benefiting from the food that your sons bring home, and you haven't done anything about it. So it's a big call out. And so Eli is responsible here as well. It's not just his sons. This man of God is saying, why didn't you remove them? Why didn't you do something? It's great that you talk to them, but when do you take action? There's a lesson there for us as well. When do we take action? So the third snapshot is this story about the Ark of the Covenant. Now, I know that many of you have been in church for a long time and you know what the Ark of the Covenant is, but many people who have not been in church a long time, they only know what the Ark of the Covenant is because of what? Yes, because of the Indiana Jones thing. So I just want to say, if you're thinking that, you're right, kind of. That is the article of furniture that was in the temple in the most holy place, where it was said that the presence of God continually dwelled with the children of Israel. And it was this furniture, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So let's read the verses first, and then we'll take them apart. We are now in chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. By the way, I forgot to give you the background. This is still in the time of the judges, basically. Samson was one of the judges. He passed away. Eli is known both as judge and priest. So it's kind of like a continuation of that time period if you're wondering where we are in time. And the Philistines, although they and Israel had gone back and forth. And with Samson, they had been subdued for a time, and now they're rallying back again. And so, Israel's always in battle with them during this time period. Israel went out against the Philistines and encamped beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped in Aphek. Then the Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel, and when they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army in the field. So they meet up, they go at it, Israel sustains heavy losses. What do you think they do? Yes. So the elders, by the way, a mark of the time of the judges is this often repeated phrase, like, there was no king in Israel. Basically, the elders of Israel did whatever they wanted. It was a mad mess. So these guys, they get together. They're like, oh, man, we had heavy loss. What do? I know. Let's go get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it here, and we'll use it as kind of like a talisman, and it'll give us strength and power, and God will be with us, and we'll kick their butts. So let's see if that's what happened. So the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark of the Covenant came into the camp, all Israel shouted so loudly that the earth shook. I don't know if that's ultra literal or if that's poetic language, but there's only been one time where I've ever had so much yelling that the earth shook. Can you guys guess? It was a stadium. Yeah, sports events. People get the whole, So it probably wasn't like that, but it's probably kind of like that, where the crowd goes wild when they catch a glimpse of the ark coming in. And if they knew it was good for them, they probably wouldn't have done that. They probably would have been hushed with silence to say, like, oh my goodness, someone's removed the ark from the tabernacle. But no one thought of that. That's not the state that Israel was in at the time. They're just like, yeah! It's like a Braveheart scene or something. And so they're all pumped. The Philistines are terrified. And they get together and they say, you guys, you're going to have to fight like men because the Israelites have just brought into the camp their God. This is the same God they knew that had done all the wondrous things against the Egyptians. And so that's the story they knew, and and they're like, oh my goodness, we need to fight. And it turned out that they did fight. They fought incredibly well, and 30,000 of the Israelites were killed. It's not the end of the story. We won't talk about the tumors that they got later because they had the ark. But for that moment, they were victorious, and the Israelites were routed. So to really understand the story, to understand what was going on with the ark and why this was a bad idea, we have to really go back to the ark, take a look at it, and know what this piece of furniture is all about. So this was not just a pretty box that got a movie made about it. This was the ark, the protecting place of the covenant. This was the place where the 2 tablets of stone that God had communicated his will and his way to the Israelites, this is where it was sitting in. The 10 Commandments were inside of that, along with a couple other things. I bet you know what they are. Aaron's rod, which had floured, a sign of a miracle, and a little bowl of manna, which God had provided food for the Israelites when there was no other food in the wilderness. So it was God's law and some miracle, some reminders of the wondrous works that he had done. I mean, there's thick symbolism that we don't have time to talk about. But the coolest thing, and the thing that I want to draw your attention to, are those 2 angels on the top. Because while God is all about the law and all about justice, he's even more all about mercy. And this is called the mercy seat. And it's the place where it's said that the presence and the light of God was seen, even outside of the tabernacle. It was like a little nightlight for the camp of Israel. They'd wake up, have to go to the bathroom outside because, they didn't have the flushies. So they would be like, oh, where am I? Stumbling out of their tent. And they'd be like, oh, cool. God's still here in the presence of Israel. I can safely use the bathroom. This is a place where God's presence would dwell. And I don't know if you saw it in the text, but there's a couple places in the Bible where we are told that the whole point of this is because since the beginning, since the fall, God has been looking for a place and a way to meet with his people. And this was the place that he would meet with his people. And not everyone could see it. Not everyone would get to cast eyes on it. But sometimes when it was moved, people got to catch a glimpse of it. And once a year, the high priest got to come in front of its presence and commune with God there. So, part of this is a little bit of my, I think they call it sanctified imagination. But how do you think Hophni and Phinehas went about getting this ark and bringing it down to the battlefield? We're going to talk about that for a second. What should have happened is that once a year, the high priest would make sacrifices for himself and his family to make sure there was no sin that they had not confessed before the Lord. They were searching their hearts on their pillow. They would lay their head down at night and they would say, God, if there's anything between us, let me know. I want to make it right. And then they would make sacrifices for their sins and their family sins. And they would also say, God, in this camp of Israel, what's not right here? What do you want to tell us? Teach us about our congregation. What do we need to confess as a people? And the Holy Spirit would let them know, and they would make sacrifices on behalf of all the people. And then, They would go into the temple and they would light, well, there was always incense, and they would make sure that there was this great cloud of incense. And then, and only then, would they dare to go pass through the curtain into the most holy place and sprinkle the blood and ask for God's forgiveness for the camp. There was this whole ritual, again, which we won't go into in detail, but there was so many rituals, so many opportunities to sift their conscience and make sure that everyone was right before God. Now, Hophni and Phinehas, they show up down at the battlefield with the ark. We don't know how long after it was, but it doesn't seem like it was that long. Do you think that these worthless priests, misrepresenting God in every other way, decided that day that they were going to go get their dad, Eli, and go through the whole process? We don't know. It's not in the Bible, but I highly doubt it. And man, it's insane what they were risking to do that. But it seems like they had totally forgotten. They completely disregard the beautiful and sacred trust of God's communication through the sacrifices. Look, these guys were fooling around their whole lives. They fooled around with the peace offering, and they should have been found out. They should have found out that God doesn't like that trifling. They should have been busted the first time. They were fooling around with the women who were serving at the temple. They should have found out then. And now, they're fooling around in a big way. And they go in, they get this, Ark of the Covenant, they head on down to the battlefield. My friends, they should have found out the second they put their little toe inside that most holy place. They would have known the story of Aaron's two sons who just a couple generations before offered a strange offering before the Lord, and those guys, instant dead. They would have known that story. They knew the stakes, but somehow they had become, like Ellen White wrote, emboldened by sin. And so they fooled around. But here is what I want to impress on you today. They fooled around, but instead of finding out God's judgment, they found out his mercy that day. Because God gave them extra time to think about how to act in his presence. God is about justice, but he's more about mercy. No other way than God's mercy would two fake priests be able to approach God without dropping dead. Literally, no one except their father would have even had a second of mourning. No one except their father would have thought another second if God had allowed them to die in his presence. Israel probably would have rejoiced, am I right? But God withholds judgment until he's certain that someone's heart is so hardened that they're going to continually do damage to themselves or others unless he takes them out. So if you're wondering about God's judgment, if you're wondering why he didn't intervene, it's because he saw something in those two boys that he thought, maybe if I give them an extra day, they'll understand. If there's any way to save his children, God's going to do it. If there was any way to save Hophni and Phinehas, even if he had to bend his own rules of allowing them to come in, he was going to do it. Perhaps God was hoping that when they saw the light of his presence, they would see the light of their evil. Perhaps he was striving along with them, hoping that when they saw the lid with those two angels on it, covering their eyes, that it would be called out of them to search their hearts, to cover their faces, to realize that they were in the presence of a holy God and that it was time to make a change, as painful as that would be, time to admit that they hadn't been living right. Maybe, again, this is my sanctified imagination, maybe this is the first time these boys had been alone with the Ark of the Covenant, and maybe they decided they wanted to peek under the lid. And maybe God thought, if I allow them to be reminded of the law that they've been breaking here, right here in this camp in front of me, all these laws, maybe it will do something for their hearts. Or maybe if they see this Aaron's rod and this little bowl of manna, and they remember, this is the God who did miracles, maybe they would take a minute and think, reflect on their own lives. Maybe they'd change their ways. Because only once a year, after much personal sifting, after many rituals, did people come in and see this. That's how you approach and meet God. There are tons of lessons to be learned in this. I've heard this story so many times as a message to parents. And as a new parent myself, those messages weren't lost. It's not good to be permissive. We've got to cut out the sin when it's tiny and small before it takes over a nation. All those things. Lessons about leadership and how everyone follows the leaders, whether or not we like it. I mean, there are just so many good things in this story, but the thing that I took away was that Hophni and Phinehas should have dropped dead, and God strove along with them. It's the message of God's mercy. They fooled around, and they found out, but they found out God's mercy. Hophni and Phinehas completely disregarded everything that God had asked them to do. But perhaps he thought that while they traveled down south with the ark, they'd have time to process. So he gave them even extra time to think about God's mercy. But they were lost, and they were leading the whole nation to be lost. And so, because of that, God was merciful to the nation of Israel and allowed Samuel to come up. So what seems to be harsh judgment and punishment for two wayward young men was God being merciful to the nation of Israel and helping them to prolong their time as a nation. My friends, there's lessons for us today. God is more merciful than you can imagine. And I know it seems cheap, but the more we fool around, the more we find out his mercy. And so God has a heart, a soft spot, a place where he says, listen, we see you. We know what you've done. We know the thing that you confess when it's like okay to confess. We know the thing that you've done that you are okay telling your parents, your friends, or your spouse about. It's like the not so bad thing. But my friends, God has a heart for people who have done atrocious things. The things that you wouldn't tell anybody, ever. And he still sees good in us. He still sees good in me. He still sees good in you. We could fool around and continue to find out his mercy as long as we're not going to hurt ourselves or others too far. God's mercy continues. You might see it. You're not going to see it in the light of God's glory on top of the Ark of the Covenant. Because, first of all, we don't even know where that is. But that's not where you experience God's light of his love. It might be in the rebuke or the correction of someone who loves you, like Eli was trying to correct his sons. God was speaking through that. It might be in a symbol or ceremony full of other-centered love and values that you resonate with. That's God trying to prick our conscience, show us how beautiful things can be. You might find out about God in the innocence of a child. I've been enjoying looking at my baby and thinking about how innocent and pure she is. And I've found out God's mercy that way. Oh, didn't expect that. And God shows his goodness through forgiveness when we haven't even asked for it, like from each other. So there's all these moments, these snapshots in our lives where we have the opportunity to respond to God and his mercy, or we continue in the path like Hophni and Phinehas, and we just keep closing down, callousing, hardening our hearts. That's not God's wish for us. His wish for us is to hear his voice, to see his light in every place that we can. And by the way, this doesn't happen a lot in church. It happens in church, but this happens in everyday life when we're out living and loving people. And so I want to ask you today, Sunnyvale, to keep your eyes open for the light of God's presence in expected and unexpected places. And that if you fool around, if you think that you've gone too far one way, if you've experimented, if you know he's talking to you, but you've continued to take a step away from his light and his presence, I want to ask you today, acknowledge that. Acknowledge that during the song, during the time of prayer. Say, God, I don't want to be like Hophni and Phinehas. I don't want to be the kind of leader that leads someone astray, someone in my own home, my workplace, one of my kids. I don't want to live like that. I want to be continually coming toward the light of your presence. I want to fool around and find out your mercy, but I don't want it to have to extend too far. I want to meet you on that mercy seat. That's my challenge today to you, Sunnyvale. During this time of contemplation, during this song, think about the mercy seat. Think about the light of God's presence and how he strives long with his children. And if there is a place where you've been resistant and you've been holding out, meet him there at the mercy seat today and surrender. I have a feeling that Hophni and Phinehas would have been extremely excellent leaders. There is a place for people who are not into tradition. There's a place for people who don't want to just do things because they're being done. There's a challenger in all of us, a rebel in all of us. And if you let God take control of that, that's beautiful leadership that's going to come out of that. But if you're doing it for self and to take advantage of people, that's the path we're avoiding. So Sunnyvale, I'm running on and on. I just asking you today to consider God's mercy and how you can find it out today.